Thanks, Brad. And again, let's ask God's guidance as we go through this. Thanks, God, for this passage, and I ask you that you would guide our thoughts. Help us, Lord, to focus on what you're saying here today. Help me to speak it as you would want it spoken. Help us, Lord, to learn the lessons that are here for us in this passage. Just go before us and guide us, we ask in Jesus' name, amen. A couple had just had their second child. The first child was about 4 years old. And when they brought the baby home from the hospital, they noticed their 4-year-old son was quite attentive and was always hovering over the baby. And the parents had to kind of get him to back off a bit to give the baby some space. And finally the 4-year-old asked if he could be alone with the baby for a bit. And the parents didn't know what to think about that, but they kind of looked at each other and then said, sure, and they left the room. But they kind of stayed at the door just to watch and listen to see what the 4-year-old was up to. And this is what they saw and heard. As soon as the boy was confident that he was alone, he leaned over the baby and said, "Quick, remind me what God is like. I'm 4 years old and I'm starting to forget." And aside from the cuteness of that story, it does speak to a desire that is likely in each one of us. We all, I think, have a desire to really know what God is like. We all have a desire within us to know God, to connect with God, to relate to God. And whether most people would recognize that yearning in them for what it is, I don't know, but that is what it is. The Bible, of course, does give us a lot of teaching about who God is and what some of his attributes or characteristics are. Now, God is God, and there is no way we can ever comprehend him fully with our finite human minds, but we are given the information we need to have a relationship with God. Some teachings from the scriptures on God, what God is like, is very straight out and forward, just teaching this is God is this, God is that. Other teachings come in the form of stories. Stories of how God relates to people. And from that we see illustrations of those characteristics or those attributes of God. So we can tell from those stories some things about what God is like. Like the story we're going to look at this morning. We're continuing on our study through the book of Genesis, and we come to chapter 8 today, which was just read. Remember, a couple of weeks ago we left Noah and his family and the animals in the ark floating on top of the floodwaters that covered the entire planet, as we saw there in chapter 7. Chapter 8, as you were listening, as Brad read, is the story of the floodwaters receding from the land, the ark coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and the land eventually drying up, and then Noah and his family exiting the ark, and God making a covenant with them. So what we're going to do this morning is, again, first of all, go through the events of this chapter, and I'll take some time to explain some of the mechanisms that would have happened to make all this happen the way it's described here in chapter 8. And the reason I want to do that is to show that it is very reasonable to just interpret this entire story just as it is presented here. And to reassure us that the Bible is completely trustworthy. And then in application, we will take a look at the story, in particular, the actions and the words of God in this story, and what they tell us about some of God's attributes or some of God's characteristics. This story tells us some things about God that are very applicable and meaningful to us today. So we'll take a look at that in the application. So we left off last time at the end of chapter 7 with the information that the floodwaters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. The waters came up from the ground. We looked at this last time. The waters came up from the ground in conjunction with what would have obviously been massive seismic activity and tectonic movements that went on. We saw that last time. And this was the time when the original supercontinent that God had created, and as described in chapter 1 of Genesis, this is the time when that supercontinent divided and the different continents drifted apart. It also says the rain came down, rain fell, and it is a possibility that there was a water canopy above. We read chapter 1, it kind of sounds that way. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's one interpretation, but this water canopy would have fallen during that period of rain, 40 days and 40 nights of rain. The result was that the waters flooded the entire planet, covering the highest mountains that were there at that time by about 20 feet. So it may mean in 7 verse 24, right at the end of chapter 7, that the waters reached their peak at 150 days, or maybe it peaked before that, but it remained at that level for 150 days. But after the 150 days, it says that God remembered Noah and his family and all the animals, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water started receding. And the author makes note of the fact that the fountains of the great deep had stopped, the rain had stopped, and so after the 150 days, the waters had started receding. Now keep in mind that there is still a whole lot of stuff going on in the earth underneath all this water. As the tectonic plates are shifting, continents are moving, some parts of the earth are rising up, other parts are sinking. So along with the wind aiding the evaporation of the water, there is this shifting of land masses going on underneath the water. And so it came about that still at the 150-day mark, 8 verse 4, the ark ran aground on the mountains of Ararat. Now the ark being the size that it was, those who have done a little research on this know when you have a great big ship, big boat, how much of the boat is underneath the waterline. So the ark being the size it was would have had about 20 or 25 feet of it below the waterline as it floated. So it would have run aground before any of the land peaks would have been visible. So at its peak, the waters were just high enough to float the ark above the highest peak, but likely not by much. And as the water started receding, it wouldn't have taken much for the ark to run aground on the height of some mountain range. So there the ark sat, and all Noah and his family and the animals could do was to wait until the water disappeared from the earth, and so they could leave the ark. It took 3 more months, according to what is told here, for the water to go down enough for them to be able to see the tops of the mountains. Looking out the window of the ark, when their line of sights would have been, took 3 months before they could see tops of the mountains. Now keep in mind, during this time, the continents as we know them today are rising up, the ocean floors are sinking, and with all the seismic activity, the mountain ranges as we know them today, as we see them today, they're being pushed up. It is this activity of the water draining off the continents as they rise up and the seafloor sinks that produced much of the land formations that we see today and the mountain ranges that we see today. The draining of the water amidst the rising of the mountain ranges carved the valleys and the canyons and shaped the mountains and produced the continental shelves and everything else that we kind of see today. All this action would have also produced all the sandstone sediment that is seen all over the world. And of course, with all the animal life being killed off during this flood, these receding waters would have carried and swooshed all the carcasses around and would have buried many of these animals in the sediment, which would turn to sandstone and limestone, creating the fossil beds, which archaeologists and geologists have discovered and are continuing to discover. And all the geological layers that have been discovered and are really plainly visibly evident in deep canyons, they would have formed during this period of the water receding off the earth. Massive amounts of running water is an incredibly powerful force and will lay down multiple layers of sediment in a very short period of time. Volcanoes will do the same thing. And of course, with all this seismic activity going on in the earth, there would have been lots of volcanoes happening at the same time as this all is going on. So when you look at it in that light, that during this latter stage of the flood, when the waters have receded and are receding, and the different land masses are moving and rising and falling and so on, this is the time that the different layers would have formed with the different animal fossils in them. But they were all laid down within the time frame of this year-long flood. So I'll just touch briefly on this evolution creation debate. The underlying assumptions of atheistic evolution is, number one, everything that has happened has to have a natural cause. That's the underlying assumption of atheistic evolution. Everything that has happened has to have an atheistic cause. A natural cause. There is no room for considering God or supernatural forces of any kind. That's unscientific. It all has to have a natural cause. Because as soon as you introduce God or supernatural forces, that goes to the area of religion. And religion is spiritual in nature, it's not physical. So everything being discovered today has come about by natural cause. That is the underlying assumption of atheistic evolution. So everything discovered today came about by these natural causes. And then the second underlying assumption that they have is uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism. Which means that everything has always happened the way we see it happening today. The forces we see today, the processes we see today, that has always been the way it has always been from the beginning. So that assumption leads them to conclude that the layers we see in the geological record are millions of years old because it takes them millions of years to form. Just watch. Look how long it takes for dust and whatever to accumulate to form a layer. At the rate we see it going today, it'll take millions of years. And if you go by the processes we see going on today with no catastrophic events, yeah, it's likely right. So those are the assumptions of the atheistic evolution. The assumptions of biblical creationists are first, that there is a God who is active in the affairs of the universe. And second, going along with that the Bible is the inspired word of God and is true and accurate in what it says and is the ultimate authority for all truth. That's the basic underlying assumption for us as Christians and for biblical creationists. So you see how these assumptions will color how you view the data that you find. If you believe the Bible is true and interpret the data that you find in light of what the Bible says, you will come up with a totally different conclusion than if you reject the Bible and reject the idea of a God who's active in our universe. Well, which assumption then makes more sense? Now, obviously, we believe the biblical assumptions make more sense. And so to support that, I'll just throw this one thing out. There's lots of good information on the internet on this. You can do your own research. But to support this, we can look at Mount St. Helens. We know when that volcano erupted. Anybody remember when Mount St. Helens erupted? I remember that. Yeah, we got some volcanic ash at our house in Herbert. Mom was dusting. Oh, what is this? And then, oh yeah, it was the ash from the volcano. We know when that volcano erupted. We know how long it was active. We watched it happen. We know how long the lava flowed. And it left a series of geological layers that are quite evident and is exactly the same as the geological layers you find, say, in the Grand Canyon and in other parts of the earth. All those layers were deposited and laid down in a matter of weeks. So geological layers don't necessarily take millions of years to deposit. Given a large-scale catastrophic event, it can be done in a very short time. And friends, this event of this flood described here in the Bible was a massive catastrophic event that wasn't included or engulfed the entire planet. And it is a very good explanation of the geological formations that we have found and are finding. It's a very good explanation of the fossil record that is being found. So I just threw that out there. So moving on in our story, 40 days later, after the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, Noah opened the window of the ark and let a raven out. The raven flew around till the water dried up. Never did come back to the ark. Likely found some floating carcass to rest on and eat from or whatever. And then Noah let out a dove. The dove flew around, couldn't find anywhere to land, came back to the ark. 7 days later, Noah let the dove out again. This time the dove came back with a freshly picked olive leaf. So Noah knew that Noah knew that there were at least some spots of the earth that were dry and there's some vegetation beginning to sprout on some parts. Now keep in mind the ark ran aground on top of the Ararat mountain range someplace. So it's pretty high up. So likely the lower elevations were still covered in water. 7 days later, he sent out the dove on his third reconnaissance mission. This time it didn't come back. So obviously it found a place to land in and feel comfortable in, maybe start nesting in or whatever. Verses 13 to 14 tell us that, if you do the math, about 11 months after Noah and his family entered the ark, the water was dried up from the land. Noah removed the covering from the ark. He saw the dry land. But they stayed on the ark for another almost 2 months till the land was totally dry. So they were on the ark just over a year in total. Just over a year. God then gave the directions for Noah to leave the ark and also the animals, and they came out onto a land that was totally different than the land that was there before the flood. Everything would have been totally different. First, everything would have been very bare when they came off the ark. Vegetation is coming, it's coming, but there's no tall trees anywhere yet. There's no animals except the ones that came off the ark. Would have been a very, very quiet, quiet place and bare. And all the land formations would have been totally different. There would have been nothing recognizable for Noah and his family when they stepped off the ark. Totally different world, totally new world. People often speculate as to where the original Garden of Eden is, as described back in Genesis chapter 2. Well, when you think about this, there is no way you can ever know, or we can ever know, where the Garden of Eden is. It would have been totally destroyed in the flood. Perhaps buried under hundreds of feet of sediment, perhaps buried under a mountain range someplace, or perhaps torn apart by the separation of the continents. But I'm pretty confident it doesn't exist anymore and will never be found. It was destroyed. Also, people have been searching for hundreds of years for Noah's Ark. I mean, you've probably all read the stories of the search for Noah's Ark, and every now and then there's a claim that they found it, and they're pretty sure, but there has never ever yet been anything confirmed that they found Noah's Ark. There is a mountain in the Middle East called Mount Ararat, but notice here it just says the ark grounded in the mountains of Ararat. So it's referring to a mountain range. It's not referring to a specific peak. So it's really difficult to pinpoint where to even look for this ark. Maybe one day it'll be found, and that'll be very interesting if it is. But it may never be found. And when I think about it, and I put myself back into the story, if I put myself there, it's a good chance that Noah and his family would have dismantled it and used the wood to build shelters until the earth started growing trees big enough to start building stuff or whatever. Or maybe they used it for fire, would have needed it to use it for firewood until the bushes and trees got big enough. So it may have been dismantled, or it may have rotted away. It may never be found either. Going on, verses 20 to 22 tells us that after leaving the ark, Noah built an altar and offered a burnt offering to the Lord, and God was pleased with it. And God made a commitment at that point that he would never again curse the ground with a worldwide flood to destroy everything as he just did. He's never going to do that again. From now on, God said, as long as the earth remains, there will be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. So that's the story of this text. So let's quickly now look at the application, which I said at the beginning. What does this tell us about God? And what kind of a God he is? It's good for us to grow in our understanding of who God is, and a study of some of the characteristics of God is demonstrated in this passage, in this chapter, going to help us do that. So three things I want to look at that I see, and the first one is that God remembers. Chapter 8, verse 1, then God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused the wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. This tells us something about God. It tells us that God is a God who remembers. Now, we need to be careful not to interpret this as if Noah and his family and the animals on the ark had kind of slipped God's mind for a few months. You know, God kind of got busy doing other things and kind of forgot about Noah and the ark for a bit. And then at the height of the flood, he kind of smacked his head and said, oh, right, I got Noah and the ark over there. Better do something about them. Forgot about them for a bit. No, that's not what happened. That's not the right way to interpret this. When the Old Testament reads or says that God remembered, it combines the idea of God's faithful love and his timely intervention. It combines those two ideas, to use the words of commentator Derek Kidner. God's remembering always implies his movement toward the object of his memory. So God never forgot about Noah and the ark. They were a key piece of what God is doing here. It means that at this point, the time was right, and God moved toward Noah and the ark in the sense of causing the waters to recede and bringing the ark to a safe resting place and getting Noah and his family and the animals off the ark. God remembered. And this is a timely principle, a timeless principle, a timeless truth about God. One of the characteristics about God is that he is a God who remembers. And that's just as true for you and I today as it was for Noah. In this great trial for planet Earth, and this great upheaval and trial for Noah and his family, God remembered them and God moved to bring resolution. God doesn't forget about his people, friends. God does not forget about his people. He remembers. And this is especially true when we're going through times of struggle and trial. And you kind of feel abandoned. You think Noah and his family, after floating on the rising water for 5 months, seeing nothing but water, think they wondered if God had forgotten about them? We aren't told, obviously, but I think it's possible. Trials, hard times, struggles, they're like that. It just seems to go on and you can't see any end to it. We as a church family, we're in that in a sense, as we grieve the loss of Mary. We all felt so helpless as we watched her go so quickly. And now kind of we're in a bit of a wasteland, wondering what's next. And where is God anyway? Has he forgotten us? Friends, hang on to this truth because it's true. God is a God who remembers. He's not going to forget about you. He will remember you, and when the time is right, he will move to bring you through to resolution and to the next step. He loves you. He is committed to you if you are his child, and he will not forget about you. God is a God who remembers, and he will remember you. Secondly, God directs. God directs. I'm looking at verses 14 through 17. So the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat at the 150-day mark. That's 5 months. The water kept receding. 40 days later, Noah sent out the raven, and it didn't come back. Then a dove that did come back. 7 days later, the dove again, this time with the leaf in its beak. 7 days later, the dove again. This time it didn't come back. So we know that the water had receded to the extent that the dove found a place where it was comfortable to stay. So that's 204 days. Still no word from God to leave the ark. Verse 13, we're given here even a broader picture of the time frame. Back to chapter 7, verse 11 tells us that the 600th year of Noah's life, 2nd month, 17th day, Noah went into the ark and the flood started. 8 verse 13 tells us on the 601st year of Noah's life, 1st month, 1st day, the water was dried up from the earth. Noah took the covering off the ark and saw that the ground was dried up. So that's 10.5 months they've been on the ark. So if the ground had dried up, why didn't they leave the ark? We can only conclude that God hadn't yet given directions for them to leave the ark. So they stay on the ark till the 2nd month, the 27th day of the month. That's another 57 days about after it says the earth had dried up. Another 2 months almost. Wonder if they're getting a little antsy? Wonder if they're getting a little cabin fever? Well, obviously God knew something Noah didn't. The earth looked like it was dried up, but it was likely still unsafe for Noah and his family and the animals to leave. Maybe still not enough vegetation to feed the animals. Maybe the ground's still too soft in the majority of places for habitation. So they wait another 57 days, almost 2 months on the ark after it appeared that the ground was dry. So the total time Noah and his family and the animals were on the ark is just over a year. And then God gave them directions to leave the ark, verses 15 through 17. And they did, and they entered into this totally new world. And the principle we see here is that God is a God who directs. When the time is right, God will direct his people to the next step, the next course of action. And again, this is very applicable to you and I. It may seem like God isn't saying anything. We've been waiting. He's not giving any directions. He's not giving any word. You're in a trial. You're in a struggle. You feel like you don't have any direction. You'd really like some direction from God here. You're not getting any. Kind of like Noah and his family on the ark for those last 2 months. Just waiting. No direction from God. But when the time is right, God will direct. The waiting is the hard part. But much of the Christian life is waiting. We are always in a hurry. We are a society that insists on things happening instantaneously. What's your reaction when the website that you're trying to get onto takes 35 seconds to load up? It should happen right now. As soon as you click, shouldn't it be there? And it isn't. What's going on here? I got to talk to the server. I got to phone them. Oh, okay. Yeah, well, 35 seconds. Okay, that's the kind of society we are in these days. But the Christian life is not like that. God doesn't work on that schedule. He knows when the time is right. We don't. And so we wait. And when the time is right, God will give the directions you need. Friends, remember this and take hold of this. God is a God who directs. If you are his child, he will, when the time is right, guide you to the next step, your next course of action, your next phase of life. In the meantime, wait. Thirdly, God promises. As you read verses 20 through 22, you see Noah building an altar, sacrificing a sacrifice to God. God was pleased with the sacrifice. And in that context, God made some promises. He made a covenant with Noah and his family and their descendants. Chapter 9 goes into more detail on this covenant, which we'll look at next time. But the basic promise is given here in verses 21 through 22 of chapter 8. The promise was that God would never again destroy the earth with a flood like he just did. God said, I know man is sinful. The intent of his heart is evil from the youth on. But I will never again destroy the planet with a flood. From now on, he says, as long as the earth remains, there will be a regular cycle of seasons, of days and nights. And those cycles won't stop until as long as the earth remains. That was God's promise. Now we do know from the New Testament prophecies that there is a time coming when God will destroy the earth and make a new heaven and a new earth, but it won't be with a flood. So that was God's promise. He's not going to do this again. That must have been a great relief for Noah. Kind of like, whew, glad we won't have to go through that again. And they could get on with life. God is a God who promises. And we see this characteristic throughout the scriptures. He gives promises to his people. And we are called to place our faith in God and in the promises of God and to live by that faith. For Christians today, there are many promises God has given us that we need to place our faith in. We just talked about waiting. What does the Bible say about those who wait? Those who wait upon the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get weary. They'll walk and not faint. God has promised that he will cause all things to work together for good to those who love him. He's promised to provide for us. He has promised never to leave us or forsake us. He's promised to give us the strength to do whatever he calls to do. And we could go on and on. God has given us all these promises. God's a God who promises. And friend, place your faith in God and in the promises of God and live according with those promises, because God doesn't lie. He will keep his promises. So place your faith in God and the promises he gives and live your life in accordance with that. So therefore we see from this passage some characteristics of God illustrated for us that are good for us to understand. God remembers always. He won't forget about you. He remembers. God directs. He wants to guide his people, and he wants us to follow his direction. He will direct. We need to wait for his direction and then follow his direction. Thirdly, God promises. God has given us wonderful promises, and he is faithful. He's a faithful God who keeps his promises. And we need to go on with faith in God and his promises and follow him. We've been through a difficult week. Probably for some more so than for others. But let's remember what kind of a God he is. And keep our faith strong and follow him. Let's take our moment of silence. And just open your heart to God and what he may be saying to you personally here this morning. I'll give you a few moments.